Have you ever heard of the iron masks used to silence and punish the enslaved? What seemed like a medieval torture device was, in fact, part of the cruel routine of slavery. Benefit. In this video, you will discover how this instrument of humiliation was used, what it symbolized, and why its memory still echoes as an open wound in our history. Mystery. But the most shocking part is not only what the iron masks did to the body, it is what they revealed about the minds of the masters and the system that sustained all this violence. Get ready, because what you are about to hear is not just history. It is a mirror of what we still live today. Imagine the cold weight of iron against the skin, the smell of sweat, rust, and blood mixing with the suffocating heat of the slave quarters. For many enslaved people, this was not just a memory of pain, but daily reality. The so-called iron masks, dark objects that today seem to belong to a medieval age, were used here in colonial lands as instruments of punishment and control. They were placed on the faces of those who dared to sing, pray, smile, or simply raise their voices against the silence imposed by the masters. The piece was heavy, designed to hurt. It covered the mouth and nose, leaving only small holes for breathing. Eating became nearly impossible. Drinking water was torment. Enslaved people were forced to spend hours, sometimes days, with the mask pressed against their flesh, causing deep wounds that became infected and left permanent scars. But the goal went beyond physical pain. It was to erase identity, to suffocate any expression of humanity. The overseers knew very well the psychological effect of the mask. It not only silenced lips, but also humiliated in front of everyone. The enslaved stopped being seen as a person and became a living example of punishment. The community in the slave quarters watched in silence, gripped by fear. Every look at that punished companion was a warning. This can happen to you if you dare disobey. And there were many forms of disobedience: laughing too loudly, talking too much, singing an ancestral song, or even praying in a way that displeased the master or mistress of the big house. What today would be considered a simple act of faith or culture could then be seen as defiance or threat. The iron mask, therefore, was less about correction and more about crushing any attempt at resistance. Accounts that reached us speak of men and women forced to work under the scorching sun with this weight on their faces. Imagine cutting sugarcane, carrying sacks of coffee, or digging the earth while struggling to breathe, feeling the iron heat up until it burned the skin. Many fainted, some did not survive. And yet this cruelty was normalized as part of the system of slavery. But there was also another hidden purpose: to dehumanize the voice. The voice had always been a symbol of identity, culture, and resistance. Singing meant keeping Africa's memory alive, praying meant reaffirming faith, speaking meant communicating and organizing. To silence the voice, therefore, was to strike at the root of freedom. That is why the iron mask was so symbolic. It turned the mouth, the gateway of expression and life, into a place of pain and silence. Enslaved women were especially targeted, often punished not just for speaking, but for trying to defend their children or partners. It was common for mothers to be forced to wear the mask while breastfeeding, making the scene even more cruel. The baby in her arms, crying, and the mother unable even to sing a lullaby. This violence aimed to break bonds, destroy affection, and sow fear. And as if that were not enough, some were forced to walk in front of the big house with the mask on, exposed to the mockery of masters and visitors. Punishment became spectacle, a theater of power and submission, where the overseer showed what happened to those who did not learn to obey. It was the pedagogy of pain, a cruel lesson that seeped into the minds of everyone in the quarters. But this cruelty also left marks on the masters themselves. The use of the iron mask revealed an uncomfortable truth: fear. Behind the ostentation of the big house, behind the safety of chains and the whip, There was the constant terror that order could be broken. The silence imposed by iron was, in fact, a desperate attempt to contain something greater, the possibility of rebellion. And here the first great question arises. If the iron mask was so painful and inhumane, why was it still used? The answer lies not only in the desire to punish, but in the system that sustained slavery itself. Violence was not an accident, but the foundation of a world that thrived on forced labor. With every mask fastened, it was not just an individual who was silenced. It was a culture, a memory, an entire history that was suffocated. But as we will see ahead, that silence was never complete. Even with iron against the skin, resistance found ways to manifest, in looks, in gestures, in escapes, in quilombos. And if the mask served to silence, the master's fear served to watch. The terror imposed in the slave quarters was a direct reflection of the insecurity of the big house. At this point, we begin to understand. The iron object was not just punishment, but an involuntary confession of the master's fragile power. The forced silence echoed through the night, but the echo carried with it a promise. At some point, the voices would rise again, and in the next chapter, we will delve into this very dimension. Why was the big house so obsessed with the fear of rebellion? And how did the iron mask fit into this machinery of surveillance and terror? If the iron mask silenced the voices in the slave quarters, in the big house, it had another effect. It guaranteed a false sense of security. Behind thick colonial walls, adorned with expensive furniture, imported chandeliers and tapestries from Europe, what reigned was not only luxury, it was also fear, a constant, silent fear that grew with each passing night, the fear of rebellion. The sugar mill masters knew they lived surrounded. On one side, a tiny white population that occupied the big house and positions of power. On the other, dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of enslaved people, crammed into quarters, living with hunger, pain, and punishment. Just one spark could shatter the order. The iron mask, therefore, was not just an instrument of punishment, but a symbolic barrier against this looming threat. In the view of the slave-holding elite, to control the body was to control the mind. The overseer, a feared figure, acted as the armed hand of the big house. He was the guardian of discipline, the one who transformed the master's fear into lashings, whips, branding irons, and of course the iron mask. Each punishment was designed not only to crush the victim, but to terrify all who watched. It was pedagogy through pain. Picture the scene. An enslaved person is accused of talking too much or laughing at the wrong moment. The overseer drags him to the center of the plantation yard in front of the big house. There, under the watchful eyes of the master, the mistress, and even the children, the mask is strapped to his face. Silence is immediate, humiliation is public, and the message is clear. No one is above obedience. But this display of power hid fragility. Why such extreme violence, if not for the fear of losing control? Why impose silence with iron, if not for the terror of what might be said, sung, or organized? The masters knew that in the whispered conversations of the slave quarters, dreams of escape, songs of resistance, and plans of Quilombo were growing. Punishment was the desperate response to something they could never fully suppress, the human desire for freedom. The big house, therefore, was not just a space of comfort. It was also a fortress. Many were built on high ground, with panoramic views over the fields to watch the movements of the slave quarters. At night, torches remained lit, dogs were unleashed, overseers patrolled armed. All this apparatus revealed a paradoxical truth. The one truly imprisoned was the master himself, captive of his own fear. It is at this point that we understand the cruel logic of the slave system. The iron mask and other instruments of torture did not arise merely from individual cruelty, but from a machinery that turned fear into method. The master feared revolt, the overseer carried out the punishment, and the enslaved bore the weight of iron. Each part played its role, like in a machine of oppression that needed to run every day to keep order alive. That fear was not imaginary. Rebellions broke out in several parts of Brazil and around the world. Quilombos were formed, escapes were planned, plantations were set on fire. The rumor of conspiracy spread quickly, and often just as suspicion was enough for brutal punishment to be applied. The iron mask, in this context, was also used preventively, as a warning, as psychological terror before anything even happened. And so, the big house tried to protect itself behind forced silence. But the more iron and whips they used, the more they fueled the flame of resistance. It was a vicious cycle. Fear generated violence, and violence generated more fear. Foreign visitors who passed through the plantations reported this atmosphere of tension. Some described the abundance of the big house, but they also noticed the constant presence of guards, dogs, and punishments. Wealth was stained by insecurity, and this contradiction was impossible to hide. But there was something even darker. Many masters believed obedience had to be taught from childhood. Enslaved children were also subjected to the mask, the whipping post, the lash. They grew up learning that their voices had no value, that their laughter could be punished, that their freedom was a crime. Violence in this sense was not just repression, it was education through cruelty. Looking at this reality, an inevitable question arises. To what extent did the iron mask and other punishments reveal less about the supposed indiscipline of the enslaved, and more about the weakness of a system built on violence? And this weakness became even more visible when we look at the origins of this terror. Because the logic of the iron mask did not begin on the plantations, but long before, in the dark holds of the slave ships. In the next chapter, we will descend into the bowels of those ships. There, where it all began, we will discover how shackles, chains, and instruments of pain already announced the cruel pedagogy that would define the entire system of slavery. Even before stepping onto Brazilian soil, the enslaved already knew the taste of iron and the weight of dehumanization. The pedagogy of pain began in the heart of the Atlantic Ocean, in the dark holds of the slave ships. There, where the air was suffocated by the smell of sweat, blood, urine, and vomit, discipline did not come through words, but through chains, shackles, and the marks of branding irons. Men, women, and children were chained side by side with no space to move. Many spent weeks or even months with iron clamped to their wrists and ankles, lying on damp planks infested with rats. The goal was clear: to break the spirit before arrival. Every muffled groan, every silenced cry was part of a cruel strategy to turn people into merchandise. The sailors and slave traders knew they needed to impose absolute order, and they did it through pain. Whips tore the flesh of those who resisted. Iron instruments, similar to collars and rudimentary masks, were already used to prevent the enslaved from shouting, singing, or even trying to throw themselves into the sea. Forced silence was, from the beginning, part of the process. But even in the face of so much suffering, resistance never disappeared. There are records of enslaved people who sang in African languages, prayed their prayers, or stomped their feet against the deck in defiant rhythm. For the masters and sailors, that sound was dangerous. It was a sign of unity, of preserved identity. And the response was always the same: iron, chains, and punishment. The slave ship functioned, in practice, as a laboratory of slavery. In it, the masters tested forms of control that would later be applied in the slave quarters and plantations. What worked at sea, the chain, the whip, the silence imposed by fear, was carried onto the land. It is no coincidence that the iron mask, known from the plantations, was a direct heir of this maritime logic. The idea that the voice must be stifled to prevent rebellion. Upon arrival at the ports, The exhausted bodies were taken to slave markets. Many still bore open wounds from the chains. Others had permanent marks on their faces and wrists, living proof that the journey was not just transportation, but a ritual of planned brutality. Whoever bought an enslaved person on the dock knew they were acquiring someone already molded by terror. And that transition was brutally fast. Barely disembarked, the enslaved were pushed into the plantations where forced labor began without pause. The same iron that confined them on the ship now became mask, whipping post, or iron collar. The ocean and the land merged in a continuity of pain. On the plantations, the discipline learned on the ship was reinforced. If during the crossing, disobedience was punished with death or flogging, on the plantation, the threat became spectacle. The masters wanted everyone to see the iron mask, to hear the crack of the whip, to feel the weight of the chain. Fear became the main currency. But it is important to note a profound contradiction. The more they tried to smother the voice, the more it sought ways to escape. Even on the ships, in the midst of terror, the enslaved created codes of communication, visual signals, songs that crossed the Atlantic and survived in Brazil. Culture resisted where iron tried to silence, and it was precisely this that fed the fear of the big house. Because if even on the ship, under total surveillance, the voice was not silenced, what would stop them from rising up on land? The memory of rebellions that had already taken place in Africa, the fear of quilombos, the memory of escapes during the voyage, all of this haunted the masters' minds like a ghost. Thus, the iron mask we see on the plantations was not only a physical instrument, it was also the materialization of a trauma that came from the sea. Every time an enslaved person was forced to wear it, it was not only their voice that was silenced, it was also the collective memory of all who had crossed the ocean. The slave ship, therefore, did not end at the port. It extended into the slave quarters, echoed in the whipping post, solidified in the iron mask. The ocean never stayed behind. It seeped into the land, into the bodies, into the scars. And it is precisely there that the greatest paradox of this story is born. If the slave ship and the iron mask aimed to erase identities, they ended up producing the opposite, a culture marked by pain, but also by resistance, by faith, by music, and by the hope of freedom. And in the next chapter, we will enter this world on solid ground, the sugar and coffee fields, the forced labor until exhaustion, and how the iron mask became part of the machinery that turned lives into engines of production. The crossing had ended, but the nightmare was just beginning. Upon stepping onto Brazilian soil, the enslaved discovered that the iron of the slave ship would not be left behind. It would only change form. In the sugarcane fields, in the coffee plantations, in the mines, life was ruled by a single law: work until you collapse. The day began while it was still dark. Even before sunrise, the overseer would walk through the slave quarters, cracking his whip against the doors, waking everyone with shouts that reminded them rest did not belong to them. Men, women, and children were marched in line to the fields, carrying heavy tools, many with chains on their ankles and some, as exemplary punishment, with the iron mask pressed against their faces. The heat of the day made the work even more inhumane. Cutting sugarcane under the scorching sun, with iron heating on the skin, was more than physical torment. It was a form of planned torture. Chapped lips cracked under the metal, breathing became short, and every drop of sweat that trickled inside the mask burned like fire. For the masters, however, this pain was seen as a lesson. This is how they learned to obey. There was no limit of hours. The length of work was defined by exhaustion. If someone collapsed in the field, the overseer had two choices: use the whip to force them up, or leave them to die where they fell. The body of an enslaved person was disposable, replaceable. Yet at the same time, it was indispensable to maintain the wealth of the big house. This paradox meant that life was exploited, until the very last breath. Punishment served as the gears of this system. The whipping post, the pillory, the whip, and the iron mask were used as tools of production. They were not just punishments, they were permanent reminders that obedience was the condition for survival. The overseer knew it was enough to display a punished person in the middle of the field for the others to double their work pace. Fear was more effective than any order. Women suffered twice over. In addition to hard labor, they were victims of sexual abuse by masters and overseers. Many times, after being violated, they were forced to return to the field with the iron mask on their faces, as if the pain had no end. The body of the enslaved woman was exploited both as labor and as an object. And even so, many of them found the strength to resist, to protect their children, to keep alive the memory of their origins. Children were also brought early into the logic of labor. Some were used as field apprentices, carrying small loads, running alongside adults. Others were used as lookouts, forced to report anyone who tried to rest or escape. It was a cruel way to break bonds and sow distrust within the very community of the slave quarters. And the slave quarters at night were not a place of rest. After an exhausting day, wounded bodies were thrown into cramped spaces without ventilation, where the air smelled of sweat and blood. There, the silence imposed by the iron mask mingled with the silence of exhaustion. But in the midst of this, small whispers arose, chants, prayers, memories of Africa. It was in those moments of near erasure that resistance was born. What is striking is that the big house, in trying to smother the voice, ended up feeding an even stronger flame. Forced labor until collapse did not extinguish hope. On the contrary, it showed that freedom was the only possible way out, and that increased the master's fear. Each night was watched with more dogs, more overseers, more torches lit around the slave quarters. The violence of the day sustained the terror of the night. But what the masters did not understand was that forced labor produced more than sugar, coffee, or wealth. It produced stories, memories, symbols. Iron on the face, whip on the back, weariness in the bones. All of this became collective memory. A memory that would later be sung in circles, preserved in quilombos, and passed down from generation to generation as the seed of resistance. And here the great contradiction emerges. If the masters believed that the iron mask and punishments taught obedience, what they really taught was that there is no dignified life without freedom. Each lash was also a lesson about injustice. Each day of working until collapse was proof that the system survived only through pain. And it is in this landscape, where pain and resistance intertwine, that the quilombos were born. In the next chapter, we will see how these refugees became the living answer to the silence imposed by iron and fear. If the slave quarters were the space of forced silence, the quilombos were the stifled cry that finally found freedom. In the forests, the hills, and the most hidden places, men and women who fled iron, the whip, and the mask of obedience built new worlds. They were fragile worlds, always threatened, but filled with something the big house could never offer: dignity. Quilombos were not just refugees. They were symbols. Each escape was an act of resistance. Each community formed was a denial of the system that insisted on turning people into merchandise. There, far from the overseer's gaze, the formerly enslaved sang again, prayed again, spoke in their own languages. The silence imposed by iron gave way to voices that echoed through the night. They were voices of pain, but also of hope. Women who had been violated found space to heal. Men who had been humiliated at the whipping post regained their authority. Children who had grown up under the lash could run free. The quilombo represented what the iron mask tried to erase: identity, culture, and future. One of the greatest examples was the quilombo of Palmares, which became a symbol of resistance for all of Brazil. But it was not the only one. Hundreds of smaller quilombos spread across the territory, each one a small flame lit against the darkness of slavery. And those flames frightened the big house. For the masters, the existence of quilombos was a greater threat than any punishment could control. Because the quilombos showed that obedience was never learned, despite iron and the whip. They revealed that behind forced silence there was always a plan to flee, a desire for liberation. But the quilombos were also spaces of constant persecution. Colonial troops were sent to destroy them, hunt fugitives, burn crops, and kill leaders. Even so, for every quilombo destroyed, another arose somewhere in the forest. It was as if resistance was stronger than iron. And within the quilombos, African culture flourished. Songs, dances, drums, and prayers kept alive the memories the slave ship had tried to erase. Iron masks had silenced mouths, but they had not silenced the heart. In the night chants, in the stories told around the fire, in whispered prayers, in dances that stamped the ground, freedom became present even amid persecution. Those voices silenced in the slave quarters found their amplification in the quilombos, and that was what the masters feared, that music, faith, and culture would be stronger than iron, because culture could not be chained, it could be punished, but not destroyed. And it is striking to see that while the big house tried to impose silence, the quilombos answered with sound. Where there was a whip, there was also a drum. Where there was iron, there was also a song. Where there was humiliation, dignity arose. That was the real battle, the struggle between silence and voice. But, as we will see, not all voices found refuge in the forests. Many were still trapped within the cruel logic of religion itself, a religion that, instead of offering comfort, often reinforced obedience. And in the next chapter, we will dive into this paradox: how the church, which preached love and compassion, was used as a spiritual mask to justify slavery and impose even more silence on those already in chains. While the quilombos became refugees of freedom, inside the plantations, religion was used as yet another invisible chain. If the iron mask silenced the voice, the sermons of many priests and pastors silenced the soul. It was the mask of hypocrisy, coated in prayers and words that should have set people free, but, in practice, served to imprison them even more. The sugar mill masters attended Mass on Sundays, proud of their fine clothes and generous offerings. They brought their wives, children, and even some enslaved people, who were forced to stand at the back of the church, separated by rails or ropes. There, they heard sermons that exalted obedience, patience, and resignation as virtues. Biblical texts were cut and twisted to justify slavery, as if God had decreed that some were born to command and others to serve. This was the greatest of contradictions. The same faith that proclaimed love, compassion, and equality was used to legitimize the whip, the post, and the iron mask. Priests blessed plantations, prayed in the fields, but rarely raised their voices against violence. Some even advised masters to punish with moderation, as if it were possible to moderate dehumanization. Spirituality, which should have healed, became an instrument of control. And the cruelest part was that many enslaved people believed deeply. They grew up hearing that they should accept suffering on earth to gain reward in heaven. This message was repeated so often that it became part of daily life. Obedience was not only demanded with iron and whip, it was preached as divine will. It was as if the iron mask extended into the spirit, silencing not only the mouth, but also hope. But as in every story of oppression, there were cracks. Many enslaved people reinterpreted the Christian message in their own way. When they heard about liberation, they saw in it a concrete promise of escape and freedom. When they sang hymns, they blended them with their African traditions. Faith, which for the masters was a tool of obedience, became for the enslaved a secret weapon of resistance. Even so, the hypocrisy was glaring. Masters who prayed on their knees in the morning ordered whippings in the afternoon. Women of the big house who taught catechism to white children saw no problem in separating enslaved mothers from their children. Religion was molded to serve the convenience of power, and in that mold, the mask of faith became as suffocating as the iron mask. Picture the scene. An enslaved man punished in the field, forced to wear the iron mask, and the following Sunday taken to Mass, where he heard from the altar that servants must obey their masters. Violence became sacred. Silence became virtue. Obedience, a divine command. What greater contradiction could exist? But that hypocrisy had consequences. Little by little, the enslaved realized that the religion preached in the big house was not the same one they found in their personal prayers. They began to distinguish the master's God from the God who spoke in their hearts, a God who liberated, not one who chained. This silent discovery became fuel for future resistance, including abolitionist movements that later used the Bible to denounce rather than justify slavery. Nevertheless, for centuries, official religion functioned as a shield for the system. It gave masters the comfort of feeling righteous while exploiting. It was the spiritual mask that hid the true face of violence. And here arises an uncomfortable reflection. How many times, even today, do we use beautiful words to hide cruel realities? How many times are discourses of peace used to justify inequality? Religious hypocrisy did not remain in the past, it echoes in the present. And in the next chapter, we will look precisely at this continuity. Because even after abolition, new masks emerged, invisible but just as cruel. They are the ones that still silence voices today and maintain social chains disguised as normality. The Golden Law was signed, chains fell, and iron masks were abandoned in the basements of history. But the question that still echoes is, did slavery really end, or did it only change form? If we look around, we will notice that many chains are no longer made of iron, but they still bind. They are invisible, yet they suffocate just as much as those of the past. Structural racism is one of these chains. It manifests when a young black man is more easily stopped by the police, when a black woman is paid less for the same work, when residents of favelas live without sanitation, healthcare, or security. These inequalities are not accidents. They are direct inheritances of the slave quarters and the big house. The silence imposed by the iron mask continues to echo, now in the form of social exclusion. The favelas, for example, can be seen as the new slave quarters. Built far from the city centers, in hard-to-reach areas without proper infrastructure, they reproduce the same isolation and neglect that marked the lives of the enslaved. It is as if, even after abolition, society had found a way to keep apart those who had already been separated by the whip. The labor market also reflects these invisible chains. For centuries, the enslaved were taught to obey, to work without questioning, to accept silence. When slavery ended, there was no reparations, no redistribution of land or opportunities. Many were left to fend for themselves, with nothing. The result is that even today, the black population faces higher rates of unemployment, underemployment, and informality. Forced obedience was transformed into lack of opportunity, and we cannot forget the symbolic weight. The collective imagination, fed by centuries of slavery, still insists on associating black people with servitude, marginality, and devaluation. This is perhaps the cruelest chain, the one that binds not the body, but the mind of society. A chain that makes suspicious eyes follow young black men in shopping malls, that closes doors during job interviews, that discards lives in the statistics of violence. But just as in the past, these invisible chains also awaken resistance. Today, that resistance expresses itself in culture, in music, in art, in occupying spaces of power. Rap, samba, capoeira, and so many other cultural expressions are direct descendants of the chants whispered in the slave quarters and quilombos. They are voices that refuse to be silenced. Still, the weight of the slave-holding legacy remains present. With each news story of police violence, with each statistic on inequality, with each favela forgotten by the state, we realize that the Iron Mask was never fully removed. It only transformed into poorly disguised policies, into ingrained prejudices, into speeches that try to justify the unjustifiable. And it is here that our reflection grows even stronger. If in the past it took iron to silence voices, today indifference is enough. Society's silence in the face of injustice is the new Iron Mask, a silence that is often more cruel than the crack of the whip. But are we condemned to repeat this cycle forever? Does the Iron Mask, now invisible, still control us without us realizing it? Or is it possible to break once and for all these chains inherited from slavery? In the next chapter, we will seek that answer. We will reflect on how memory can become a weapon, how truth can break silence, and why telling this story is an act of resistance that cannot be interrupted. The Iron Mask, today rusted and forgotten in museums or in the basements of old plantations, still speaks. It does not speak with words, but with scars. Each piece of metal carries within it the memory of silenced voices, of interrupted smiles, of suffocated prayers. It is an echo of the forced silence that crossed centuries but could not erase the truth. That truth is that slavery did not survive by the strength of the masters, but by the silence imposed on the enslaved. It was this silence that turned pain into discipline, fear into obedience, humiliation into routine. And even so, silence was never complete. There were always chants sung in secret, prayers whispered in the slave quarters, stories told in the quilombos. There was always resistance. When we look at the Iron Mask, we cannot see it only as a symbol of cruelty. We must also see it as a symbol of memory. It reminds us that there was a time when the voice was considered dangerous, subversive, indomitable. And it reminds us, above all, that this voice was never destroyed. But the question that remains is, what do we do with this memory today? Do we pretend the past is behind us, or do we face the mirror it offers? Because if we pay attention, we will see that many masks still exist. They are invisible, but they are present in social inequalities, in structural racism, in the prejudice that insists on denying opportunities. Telling this story, therefore, is a political, spiritual, and human act. It is a way of breaking silence, of tearing away the invisible masks that still try to silence us. Every time we speak about slavery, every time we remember the suffering imposed, we are giving voice back to those who were silenced. We are saying that the pain was not in vain, and that is why this video is not just history, it is resistance. It is living memory. It is a reminder that silence is complicit in injustice and that we must speak, shout, denounce, and transform, because only then can the invisible chains be broken. The iron may have fallen, but the struggle continues. It continues in the favelas, in the universities, in the streets, in the voices that refuse to be silenced. It continues every time someone refuses to bow to racism, every time a story is told, every time memory is preserved. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of the Iron Mask. It tried to suffocate, but it ended up revealing the indestructible strength of the human voice. The voice that resists, that denounces, that sings, that prays, that dreams. The voice that cannot be silenced. And now I ask you, if in the past iron masks were needed to silence the enslaved, what are the invisible masks that still try to silence us today?